Greetings, my brothers and sisters. Sending gratitude to all of you who are joining in today to accompany us down the rabbit hole of self-exploration through plant medicines. My name is Ryan Sprague, and I'm here to tell you that your frequency is now set and tuned to explore psychedelic medicines and the impact they've made among the countless psychonauts exploring the last true frontier. Buy a ticket and take the ride with me as we get true first-hand accounts of the experiences, benefits, risks, and transformations taking place within the ever-expanding world of psychedelic medicines on This One Time on Psychedelics. I imagine for all of us that have been curious and interested in the realm of psychedelic medicines for some time now, it is easy to see that the landscape surrounding the industry of these medicines is developing and shifting rapidly. While many people are focusing on wanting things to stay the same way they were, others of us recognize that with anything in life, change is the only status quo, and as such, it leaves us with questions, such as where the industry is going, what new exciting opportunities are opening up, and what we can expect to see moving forward. Today's guest on the show is a gentleman who is at the forefront of this revolution, and someone I am extremely interested in conversing with to get his thoughts on these questions and more. He is a seasoned technology executive equipped with strong expertise in realms such as corporate finance, public markets, and M&A. Most recently, he was the co-founder and CEO of Future Fertility, which was focused on AI applications for human infertility before moving into his newest project as CEO of Mindset Pharma. Mindset Pharma is a company whose mission it is to be on the cutting edge of developing next-generation psychedelic medicines to treat neurological and psychiatric disorders. And in this episode, we will be expanding upon his mission within this company, how he first became interested in the business of psychedelic medicines to help the world at large heal, and much, much more. So, please help me in welcoming James Lanthier to the show. James, pleasure to have you here with me, man.
Ryan, great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, man. Like I said in the intro, I'm extremely excited to dive in. One of my favorite parts of these shows is that I get to learn a lot as well. And so I'm curious for you, how did you get interested in the business of psychedelics, right? What led you to Mindset Pharma? I'm curious to hear that journey.
Well, I think like any free thinking person, I've always been interested in psychedelic drugs, and I don't really see how you can not be interested in drugs that have this effect on people and that can cause people to really think about things differently. And I would say over the last kind of 10 years, generally aware of this, research and the evidence that was starting to build around, the use of psychedelic drugs in a therapeutic, context. So it was something I had my eye on beyond just my general interest in these drugs. And a few years ago, I was approached by some entrepreneurs that I knew who had sort of seeded some scientists who had a particular kind of point of view around where they thought, at least from a medical standpoint, the medical psychedelic market would head. And frankly, I'd never gotten involved. I'm in Toronto, Canada, and I'd never gotten involved in the cannabis business, which was a really big thing here and still is to some extent, because I just didn't really find it that interesting. But I'd always been so interested in these drugs, and if the business plan had been that they were selling psychedelic umbrellas, I think I would have still been interested in getting involved. But then when I met the scientists and really got to understand, first of all, the background of the scientists, and then kind of got to understand the strategy that they had devised for what they wanted to do, I thought it just made an incredible amount of sense. And so I got involved as fast as I could.
That is amazing. It's so funny you mentioned the cannabis industry, because cannabis is pretty much everything I do. I host courses for it, talk about it with everyone, and do a lot of stuff in cannabis. And I was in the industry for 5 years down here in Massachusetts, and you 100% hit it nail on the head. Most of the individuals that I meet that are getting into cannabis that were not already in the world of cannabis, they make it really boring. Like it is extremely boring. Yet when I get into the realm of psychedelics, every single person I've met, no matter how big or small their business is awesome. And they're having a lot of fun. I have no idea why that happens, but I'm glad you brought that up because it is an interesting dichotomy I've seen.
Yeah, well, I think probably one of the things that, whether people have personal experiences with psychedelics or not, everybody who's in, I think, the industry at this stage is in it because they at least understand the transformative potential of these compounds and what they can do for people. So I think everybody comes at it from different places, but I think probably everybody kind of shares that excitement around the potential of this class of drugs. I've worked in lots of different industries, that were changing and were dynamic, but this one to me is far and away the most exciting one that I've ever been a part of, and I feel really lucky to be able to play even a really small part in it.
Yeah, that's amazing, man. And yeah, I mean, there is so much amazingness, if you will, that comes with psychedelics, and I think that one of the best parts for me about the business side of it, as I've seen, is that we want these medicines to get the credibility they deserve, right? And if we tried to stay how they were forever, first of all, as I imagine we'll get into, it's not really the best source of resources to say, everyone just go to the Amazon and do ayahuasca, right? Because that puts a lot of pressure on the indigenous cultures down there, a lot of other things that can happen with that. And at the same time, not everyone can afford to go to a jungle, and not everyone is going to have the confidence to go to the jungle or even the want to go to the jungle, And I think that's a big part of this as well.
It absolutely is a huge part of it. And, I think if your view is that this is a really useful class of drugs and medicines, and you want, the widest possible, the most diverse, array of people and of patient groups to have access to them, then it simply isn't practical that, like you said, for everybody to schlep off to the Amazon. That is going to mean that, you're going to have huge groups of people who are never going to, groups of people who really badly could use the benefits of these drugs that are just never going to access them because, whether you like it or not, like they're only ever going to take medicines that are prescribed to them by, physicians who feel like they're able to confidently explain to them like the dosing level in what they're prescribing and that, fit within that construct. And so I think in order for us, to make sure that these medicines benefit, as many people as possible, they need to go a lot broader than the ways that they've been, taken, in the last, 100 plus years.
Definitely. We've never had such a popularity around these medicines as well and substances. And I think that one of the challenges that comes along with that is that a lot of people might have the best of intentions, right? They maybe had a friend that took a heroic dose of mushrooms and that friend has the best of intentions and tells them they should do it too. And potentially one of two things happens. Either they have this experience and they really don't have the support thereafter to integrate it or make sense of it or contextualize it. Or on the worst side, they end up getting more traumatized as a result. And now they're one of the people who's going to vote no because now it's just people getting high. And they know it because they went through it and it was complete bullshit, right? Which is obviously untrue. But that subjectiveness of people's experiences does play into the global view of psychedelics, And I think that's one of the biggest parts for me that I realized that like things can't just stay the same forever. And it's not that the way they were was perfect either. It worked really well in the cultures that it was a part of, but also we have this criminalization that's lasted so long now. And, again, for the powers that be, if you want to call them that, to see these things as credible, we're going to have to bring the science up. We're going to have to do these things that ultimately lead to getting out of just the only one view of this, and again, nothing to knock that view. I've had some beautiful experiences with indigenous elders. I love that. I also know that like my mother, for instance, would not want to go through that approach. She
You
couldn't.
said it. You hit the nail right on the head there. For your mother, for your aunts and uncles, for the majority of people, they're not going to be comfortable taking these medicines from a wellness or a ritualistic standpoint. They're going to want them to, even if they are macrodosing experiences, which are really transformative. They're only going to feel comfortable taking them in an environment where it's clear that the whole of kind of the Western medical establishment has signed off on. It's just they're not going to take them any other way. And I think for all of us who genuinely want people to have access to these these drugs, it's important that people accept that that's going to be essential. It doesn't mean that people can't access them or will stop accessing them in other ways. It's just that if you want the large majority of people to get access to them, you need health regulators signing off on them, and you need psychiatrists accepting them and prescribing them. It's just not going to happen the other way.
Definitely. And I heard Hamilton Morris, who runs Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia, at a conference talking about Bufo, aka like essentially 5-MeO DMT, but talking about like with the popularity around that one medicine alone, you could wipe out the entire population of the Bufo allivaris toad, and just like that alone, with how many people are now interested in having these experiences, we must ask ourselves, like, do we want to stick to the old ways, which we're aware now are not going to be the old ways because way more people are interested in them? Or do we want to open up the opportunity to have something like, let's say, synthetic 5-MeO DMT, to use that as an example, which actually in a paradoxical way will allow the natural ways to still exist, right? Like will allow these indigenous elders and cultures to stick around. And hey, they'll have, quite a few people still interested, but it will lessen the load of the pressure and resources that this new popularity is demanding. And I think that's so important. And one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about, talking about synthetics and things like this, is if I understand correctly, when I was looking into Mindset Pharma, you guys are exploring new psychedelic substances as well. Tell me a little bit about that and what you guys are most excited about in that journey of exploring these different types of medicines. Hey, everybody. I hope you're enjoying the show. I wanted to take a quick moment to let you all know that the doors are officially open for the Conscious Cannabis Collective. And as such, this is the last week you can sign up and receive all of the bonuses we're currently including. This is the last time I will be personally onboarding those of you who sign up with a complimentary one-on-one session, and you'll have the ability to get the Grow with Cannabis course for free during this limited time. For more info on how you can take advantage of this offer, head down to the show notes for this episode and secure your spot today, as we only have so many spots left and they are filling up quickly. Now back to the show.
Yeah, so Mindset was really started by drug discovery scientists who've worked all their careers in, I would say, the upstream part of drug discovery, right? So that's about using medicinal chemistry to design new compounds, and then early stage drug science, behavioral pharmacology, to try to understand how what you've synthesized, how it's likely to behave in humans. So that was their background, and they've worked on all kinds of different drugs in different drug categories. And the point of view that they had was that now this is 2019 that I'm talking about. By kind of 2019, 2018. There really was enough evidence that that psychedelic drugs had a therapeutic role to play, that it wasn't so much a question of like, would they? There's more work to do, but it's kind of almost a given. And their view was that big pharma ultimately would play an important role in psychedelic medicine, as they do in every other subfield of medicine, like it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And that big pharma would view the known psychedelic drugs, so the psilocybins, 5-MeO DMTs, et cetera, as really kind of a good proof of concept for what psychedelic medicine was capable of. But like they would inevitably go past the known drugs, because they gravitate towards drugs that had been, number one, optimized to make up for some of the potential shortcomings in the first generation drugs. So improve for things like duration and predictability and safety. And they'd also, for a pretty simple commercial reason, be interested in novel drugs, because the known psychedelic drugs have all been in the public domain for, many decades at this point. And, while there's a very large generic drug market, in the world, typically big pharma starts with drugs that are novel, that are new at an active pharmaceutical ingredient level. So the active pharmaceutical ingredient is like a new molecule that hasn't existed before. So we were really, I'd say, pretty much the first company, if not one of the first companies, to sort of identify this opportunity in novel psychedelic drugs, and that's what we've been working on since 2019.
Oh, that is amazing. And guys, for everyone listening who might be like, I don't know if I like this. Well, remember that LSD and MDMA are two examples of this potential technology, right? Like this has been done before with great success in a lot of ways. Also a lot of challenge as well, which makes it even more of the argument why you want the right people doing it, not the wrong people.
Well, I would say it's a great point, and it's also in a lot of ways this is what the underground. This is just a continuation of the work, frankly, that was done all throughout the 20th century after MDMA and LSD were, well after they were discovered. I mean, if you go to Shulgin, this is really just an extension of the work that he and the other underground chemists were doing. Mm-hmm. Thanks to Shulgin, we know that, those books have, hundreds of different drugs that, he developed and synthesized and, and tested. And the fact that that's the work that he did with hundreds, and those he invented a long time ago at this point, really that suggests there's a universe of, thousands of psychedelic drugs out there that are potentially discoverable. So, our scientists took the point of view that that's great. There it may very well be that the best psychedelic medicine is something that, hasn't been discovered yet, because, frankly, he was constrained. Shulgin and the underground were constrained in the work that they did. And big pharma and the biotechs that they work with, who work in drug discovery, for decades, because they had no incentive to work on these drugs, they screened them out. If they invented new drugs and they had, 5-HT2A activation, they stopped working on those drugs. They just put them to the side because there was no reason to work on them. So this is really just a kind of plain light of day continuation of that work that, frankly, we're now able to do thanks to, I'll say kind of the hard yards that the various, not-for-profit groups have done and the researchers have done over the last few decades to change the view of regulators on this class of drugs.
Oh, that is so cool. I am by no means a chemist, and I am extremely interested in that whole field because to me, it's very similar to alchemy. And I'm not truly an alchemist either, but the idea of whether it was actually led to gold, like in a physical world, or it was actually a metaphor of turning heavier vibrations into less dense vibrations, those things have always interested me, and when it comes to, again, LSD, MDMA, 2CB, any of these things that have been created, there's been I've had fantastic experiences on both of those medicines that have really opened me up in ways that I can't put into words because it's beyond words, And one of the things that I'm also aware of is that not everyone, I feel, is ready or maybe even able to have an actual true psychedelic experience in the realm of, going into the subconscious and all the interesting things that happen there. And at the same time, I read something about you guys that you were either talking about or you had done, and I'm not sure which, but that you were talking about or saying that you had done this already with individuals that were able to go through an experience with no hallucinations, but still get some of the benefits. Is that something you've currently done or something that you're hypothesizing may be available in the future?
I would say it's something that we're working on, but at this stage, it's closer to to a hypothesis. I think there's a lot of interest in figuring out whether it's possible to create a drug that probably leverages some of the same structures as psychedelic, or is inspired by psychedelic drug structures. That activates some of the same serotonin receptors. And in so doing, it, conveys some of the same therapeutic benefits as that we know, or that we're pretty convinced that come with drugs like psilocybin, but that doesn't activate, a full hallucinogenic experience. Like, obviously, if you could create a drug that had that, tick those boxes, that would be really interesting and useful, because as you say, not everybody, there are people who shouldn't have a psychedelic experience. There are patient groups, like whether that's children with ADHD, or older people with dementia, who could probably benefit from some of the pro-cognitive effects of psychedelic drugs, but you really wouldn't want those patient groups to have a psychedelic experience. And so if it's possible to create a drug that, again, has that profile, that would be really useful and desirable. So that's at this point, Mindset has probably worked on as many or more than, psychedelic drug candidates than anybody else, novel psychedelic drug candidates than anybody other biotech company that we know. But by doing that, we've really learned an awful lot about drug structure, activity relationships, how different structures interact with the serotonin system. So we're trying to apply that now to, understanding, doing the discovery work to figure out if it's possible to create, a non-hallucinogenic drug that conveys some of the same benefits. It's early days and we have some positive results so far, but I think it's a really potentially, useful and valuable area if we're successful.
Yeah, that is really cool, because again, I think about my mother, like she's seen my experiences with psychedelics and what they've done for me, but she's still stuck in years of programming, right? She grew up, she's 70, so she grew up in the just say no, this is your brain on drugs, all of those kind of things. And it's not as easy as just saying, hey, there's new science out. Belief systems go deeper than that, and so I see the ability for someone like her to benefit from something like that without actually having to go outside of her comfort zone to the level that it's terrifying. I'm curious for you, like, as someone who I can tell is very passionate about this stuff, like, what have you found to be the most fascinating thing, if you can talk about it, of course, that your company has discovered, or maybe like the most fascinating part of the work you do, put it that way, that you found so far?
Well, it's still early, but, we're trying to do things like, duration is something that I think in the drug development, psychedelic drug development, industry, you hear a lot about. And I think it's important to recognize that, like, we don't really know yet whether, a shorter duration drug can still convey the same benefits. But, definitely we have drug candidates that are pretty advanced that we're working on that, seem to induce, psychedelic, levels that are probably, comparable to LSD, but have a significantly shorter duration than psilocybin. These drugs need to get tested in humans and vetted before we really understand, fully, their parameters. But that's really exciting because, when we go out and talk to psychiatrists, who are familiar with the clinical trials or working in the clinical trials, their point of view is it's pretty much settled that in their view that psychedelic drugs have a role to play in treating, people with depression, but the duration of psilocybin is definitely, an issue for them. It's a long time for anybody to have to spend in clinic. It ties up a lot of resources. So that's why there's a huge amount of interest today in trying to get to a shorter duration drug. The other thing that we see in terms of differentiation between, the known drugs, especially on, DMT and 5-MeO-DMT is safety. So those drugs are, not psilocybin, very safe. These drugs are, not quite as safe. You can have serotonin syndrome, where people who use them can, experience an excess of serotonin in their bodies, and that can lead to a whole set of, unpleasant symptoms. And in some of our drugs, we see, significantly reduced signs of serotonin syndrome. So there's definitely kind of like white space in novel psychedelic drugs, I think, to create differentiation. So far, we've got some pretty promising signs, but with our drugs and with, all of psychedelic medicine, there's a whole lot more work that needs to be done to really answer. There's a lot more questions that need answering than we have answers at this stage.
That is perfect, and I love hearing about these things because one of the reasons I made this podcast was for education, of course, right? Like, I think that people are going to do what they're going to do. And at least if they're educated, they can make smarter choices. They can use discernment and wield the power of that to a much higher degree. And one of the things that, I've been fascinated with is, of course, we understand that the experience itself is one part of the journey. And then integrating that experience thereafter is another leg of that journey, right? Arguably a much longer leg as well, because it might go on for your entire life. And I talked to these individuals recently who run a company out of Australia named Enosis Therapeutics. And what they do is they use virtual reality to facilitate the integration process, right? So it's once the psychedelic experience has concluded, they put people into these virtual experiences that remind them of the terrain of the psychedelic medicines, but allow them to integrate. And so I'm curious for you, like, what have you guys found, if anything? I'm not sure if this is exactly your realm, but have you found certain modalities that pair well with psychedelics, either even during the experience or thereafter during integration?
Yeah, so I think, this goes back to what I said, before, and a little bit of context about mindset. So mindset is really, it's very hard to do more than one thing well. And I think what we do really well is the early stage chemistry and early stage discovery work. What we've never pretended to be are, clinical experts. So our whole model is to, create, promising drug candidates and then go partner them with groups that have what you call clinical expertise. So like clinical meaning like testing the drugs and working them through the regulatory process, proving them out in humans, and then ultimately, getting them to patients. That is not where our expertise lies. It's really on the upfront hard science and chemistry end of things. But I think, listening to your question and, talking to folks and obviously keenly watching, the news that comes out of the space and spending a decent amount of time talking to psychiatrists, I think there are so many more questions that need to be asked and that we need data to try to answer, right? So yeah, VR is something that, you'll hear and read a lot about, but I think there's a lot of even more fundamental questions that need, answers. So like, do you need therapy at all? Do you need integration? How much integration do you need? Like usually therapy helps people, but like, are there some people who don't need therapy at all? They just need access to the drug. How often do you need to take it? All these questions need good answers. And this is completely unscientific, but what I suspect is that the answer is different for different people. Because if you just kind of like match it to how people's experiences go in the underground, is that there are, different people enjoy different drugs. Not everybody enjoys the same drugs, and some drugs work better for people than some people than other people. And as I understand it, and I think that is going to be the same case ultimately with psychedelic medicine, which is to say that like there are some people who a 5-MeO-DMT trip or a 5-MeO-DMT like trip could work really well for and really help break the sort of the log jam, in their brain. There are other people that is just going to be way too much for, and that it won't ever work for them, no matter how much integration or preparation, you offer on either end of it. I'm giving you a longer answer than the question that you asked, but
No,
I think
it's perfect.
that's where ultimately my kind of hope is that the space will go. And I think that's where novel drug design also has a huge amount of potential for helping to create a future where you have lots of different kind of finely tuned or calibrated drugs that could work for different people, because we're all very similar, but we're also all very different.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because let's hope it goes that way. Because if we think about some of the challenges, specifically, let's just say around mental health right now, it's that I know for me, right? Like when I first got diagnosed with anxiety, first of all, it was after a 5-minute meeting, which is all too common. And then they
Right.
just threw a certain drug at me without knowing my particular makeup. What could happen, and what I think would be really cool, is if psychedelic medicines actually change the way that medications are given out, right? Like maybe, let's say in a futuristic world, there's an ability for them to scan potentially your physiology in some way, shape, or form and actually go, oh, this is the one that's closest for you. Or, I mean, hey, if we're really dreaming things up here, maybe there's a way to actually use AI or something to actually create a specific drug meant for you. Who knows, right? But I think at the
Yep.
end of the day, nothing is for everyone, right? That's why, like, quantum physics is a really good area to look at, where there is no objective reality. My favorite food could be tacos. I could be convinced tacos are the best food ever. But if you think pizza is the best food ever, are either of us wrong? No, we're just different, right? In that way, we're both human
Right.
beings with different preferences. And I think that with psychedelic medicines, this is going to be a very similar thing, especially with integration. I know for me, having had plenty of psychedelic experiences with other individuals, I've always found that it's pretty simple for me to get up and keep on going and integrate kind of on the go, check in. Sometimes I need a little more, sometimes I don't. Whereas I've had friends and people around me that really need like a whole week to like themselves, just to like be, sometimes they need to work with a coach or a therapist or a psychiatrist or individuals like that. So again, is one right? Is one wrong? No, I just think there's different strokes for different folks. And I think it's really important we explore those, because that's what's going to allow us to actually come to the most accurate and also responsible answer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you hear, a lot about, it's sort of a buzzword, precision medicine,
Hmm.
precision psychiatry, biomarkers. I'm hopeful that, we get to a place where there are real, objective identifiers of which drug could work better for people, because, yeah, different strokes for different folks. Exactly.
Yeah, 100%. And it's funny you brought up, individuals liking different substances, right? Like I've never really heard anyone trying to go around, and maybe I'm just super naive here, or maybe I haven't been around I don't know, correct people for this, but I've never had anyone around to me and be like, LSD is the best drug, or MDMA is the best drug, or psilocybin is the best drug. I think most people that connect with psychedelic substances, I think they understand, like, yeah, I like this. You might not. Like, that's like what I hear more than anything is, you know,
Yeah.
unlike alcohol or even cannabis, let's say, like most people, at least if they're responsible enough, are never like running around recommending psychedelics to everyone. They're saying, hey, I had a great experience. Definitely check it out for yourself. Do some research. Feel into it. Does it feel right? Maybe meet with someone, talk about it beforehand. And then, like, they might try to describe what they like about psilocybin as compared to LSD or something like that. But at least the people I'm around, they're always saying like, yeah, but also like everyone's going to be different when it comes to that. And I think it's really important to put an emphasis on that. And that's a lot of what I talk about in the show is like, guys, we're going to have people on here that are talking about particular experiences with medicines that work well for them or have worked well for them up until this point in time. But by no means is someone saying this is the medicine for everyone. Even though MDMA, for instance, if I had to pick one that would probably be the best for a large population, I would never actually make that correlation equal causation, because it would be irresponsible to do so, And I think that
Yeah.
even something like MDMA, where, I've joked often that with me anyway, MDMA is so enjoyable that you could have a blast at a funeral. I wouldn't tell everyone to go do it as a result of my experience. And I think that's also just part of being responsible, for sure.
Yeah. No, for sure. For
Yeah.
sure.
I'm curious, James, where do you see the future of psychedelic business and the realm of psychedelics as a whole going? Like, I'm sure we could take this a lot of different ways, but where would you like to see it go? Put it that way. Where would you like to see it go? And then maybe a dichotomy between where you think it's going to go.
I like to think of myself at least as like a, big tent inclusive person. So, there's at least on social media, there's this, it seems to be this kind of ongoing, war between people who look at psychedelic drugs through sort of like a wellness lens, and then draw a contrast between that and those who are working on psychedelic drugs from a regulated medical end. Mm-hmm. And I think what gets a bit tied up in that is some of the efforts that some companies have made around trying to patent drugs that have been in the public domain, or formulations of drugs that have been in the public domain, and then trying to patent some of the clinical protocols around that. I'd like to think that there's a future where, there's room for, there's room for everyone. So, at the one end, at least if I just think about kind of North America, you have the decriminalization initiatives at the, local level or state level, provincial level, and some of these, initiatives, in Oregon, where they're moving out ahead from kind of the FDA, out on their own. But, back to, an earlier theme of our conversation, you have the medical end of development as well. And I think there's no reason that these two can't, coexist to some degree. Because, again, I think there's just, if I think of my wife's aunt who's, expressed an interest in this class of drugs, she's never going to take them in anything other than a medical format. So, you're never going to stop people from arguing on social media, but or throwing slings and arrows at each other. But, my hope is that the two can coexist. I certainly understand, some of the rancor around, the IP stuff around the first generation drugs, because it is a bit silly. But anyway, I hope that's where I'm kind of hoping things will go. I think what I'm fairly plugged into is the level of the pharma interest in psychedelic drugs. And there, Mindset is partnered with Otsuka Pharmaceuticals on, a number of our new drug families. Otsuka is probably, for those who don't know, it's probably, it's definitely the most involved and knowledgeable about the medical psychedelic space of any, big pharma. The brand name Otsuka is not hugely well known, but they're a top 10 psychiatric drug company, globally. Beyond Mindset, they're also financial investors in Compass. And anyway, but I think, they're very much a trailblazer. I think there's a lot of drug companies out there that are very interested in seeing if there's or non-hallucinogenic drugs that still convey some of these same, benefits as the known psychedelic drugs, because it's a much easier model for them to get their heads around. And it's a similar way to people, how people take psychiatric medication today. The whole model of people going into a specialized clinic and taking a macro dose, a hero dose, that's very far outside of the typical, pharma model. So I think that's all to say. I think if these efforts around, non-hallucinogenic drugs actually do bear any fruit, you'll definitely see pharma get behind that. Also, definitely pharma is getting behind the macrodosing approach as well, or at least, Otsuka is. So, yeah, that's where a lot of the activity right now is playing out. But yeah, like I said, my hope is big tent. There's room for everybody. Macrodosing in a medical context, but also room for the wellness approach as well.
Yeah. I love that. If we look at the Tao and really the law of polarity and hermetics or any of these wisdom type sources, they all talk about how the middle way is the way. I believe that so much that one of my core values is the middle way, right? So we hear all of this polarity, right? Like what is arguing on social media? It's never like what middle way is the right way, because the middle way, ensues that there's no argument. It's saying, well, maybe what you're saying is right. Maybe it's wrong, right? It's always people arguing from a place of polarity, right? Eggs or meat is the best thing in the world. No, you should be vegan, right? Like it's always back and forth. And I think that as the law of polarity states, so long as you're swinging from side to side, you'll never stop swinging, And I think that the most important question to ask is, we're not going to be able to keep pharma out of psychedelic medicines. So why don't we ensure that the companies that have high ethics and values and are not going to go out and try to patent psilocybin or any of these kind of things, how do we make sure that they are the ones that are at the forefront of the pharma side of things, right? Maybe these companies are also aware that, hey, we're not trying to stop people doing it from the other approach. We're just focusing on this approach. Again, and very similar for the other point of view, right? Like, instead of trying to bash every pharmaceutical company as if they're all bad, which again, no objective reality, right? Are there bad examples out there? Sure. But I've heard horror stories of different ayahuasca retreats too with indigenous elders, right? So again, to be naive enough to think that it's only one side is just that, it's naive, And I think that being able to have an honest conversation about this and say, okay, how do we make sure that both sides have room to live within this tent? And that, let's face it, right? Like, the things that pharma wants are going to be different than the things that the natural way wants, right? Maybe the same common goal of like helping someone, but they're going to be going through avenues that neither one would want to do, right? Let's say if pharma decided, you know what, we won't get into this if the indigenous elders and that whole realm wants this piece of the puzzle. And so you then go to these elders and you're like, okay, are you ready to do molecular makeups and all of these kind of things? They're like, fuck no, we don't want to do that, right? So we're not talking about, in theory here anyway, taking away from what is already there. We're looking at expanding it into a realm that is not going to be able to be accessed by that way of looking at things, the other way of looking at things. And like we've already illuminated, will allow a lot more people to benefit, and as a caveat, will allow those, indigenous elders and cultures to be preserved and not trampled upon, and I think that's the most important thing is like, I find that a lot of people argue and waste energy on the wrong points. Like, no, farmers shouldn't get in. Well, they're in. So that's not going to be a point worth arguing anymore, right? So how can we look forward and create harmony between these two sides of the same coin so that we can all reach a common goal, which is, hey, we want to alleviate human suffering. We're going about it different ways, but we have the same common goal at the end of the day,
Absolutely. Yeah. Very well said.
Oh, thank you, James. And, this brings me to this, like, what do you believe in your own, experience is the most rewarding part of the work you're doing? Like being the CEO of Mindset Pharma, being a part of something that truly interests you, that you're passionate about. Like, what part either does fulfill you the most right now, or what part are you looking forward to fulfilling you the most as the business continues to grow?
Yeah, I think for sure there's a couple of things. So number one, purely personal, selfish level, it's fun that a decent chunk of my job involves going out and talking to people about psychedelic drugs. So like 10 years ago, I could never have fathomed that would be, something that like I would get to do. And I would just say at a 100% selfish level, like it's a lot of fun that I get to go, do that.
Yeah.
So that's one. But at a more substantial, less selfish level, we're not the best known company out there. There's other companies that have, raised more money than us, spent more money on promotion than us, that have their names, out there. But we do have a certain profile. And, like every other public company out there, we have, a general, inbox that people can send messages to. And we get messages all the time, and they are so heartbreaking from people who are at their wits' end, either because of their own personal situation or that of someone that they love and care about, who they're inevitably there's so much that's common to these messages, where it's that they have. Usually there's been some trauma in their lives, and that kicked off mental illness. And then there's this additional trauma of just that mental illness never abating, despite all of their efforts and all of the different psychiatrists, therapists, drugs that they've tried. Like, we get so many of these messages from people who will say, can you help me? Are your drugs in clinical trials? Can I get your drugs? And our drugs, some of our drugs will be in clinical trials soon, but they're just at the beginning. And I mean, we all know people who suffer from, debilitating mental illness, and may have had experiences with it, to some degree ourselves, but it's just heartbreaking to get these messages, over and over and over again. I'm not pretending that we have the magic bullet, and I don't think people in psychedelics should assume that they have the magic bullet, but based on the data, they do have the ability to help some people who aren't helped today by the standard approaches. So, you're at least working on something that's headed in the right direction, I think. So that's really, I wouldn't say rewarding because we haven't finished the job, but it's like at least lets you know that you're doing something that hopefully is useful to people.
Yeah, 100%. It's like, I know with the work I do with cannabis that it's obvious that mental health is at a crisis point. And I think that obviously, like anything, it's multifaceted. There's a lot of different challenges going on in the world. It's not just as simple as, people get born with mental illness. Maybe they do. Maybe through epigenetics, it gets expressed. Maybe they have a loved one pass away and they don't know how to handle that. Their psyche gets fractured, all these different things that happen. But we can look at it as like, okay, what do we do now? Again, I'm not someone who, I'm middle way, right? I never say pharmaceuticals are objectively bad, and is also aware that they're not the magic bullet, right? I don't think anything is, like you said. But if instead of only focusing on one way to make the magic bullet, we focus on 10 different ways to make the magic bullet, well, maybe none of us comes up with the magic bullet, but we all come up with examples of different types of magic bullets. And now we have 10 different options. And now, where we only had one option before that only worked for, let's say, I don't know, let's be glorious and say 50% of people. Well, now we have 9 more options that could potentially work for that 50%. And the more of us that start working on these things, right? And that's why I tell everyone, like, whether it's coaching, whether it's therapy, whether it's psychiatry, whether it's psychedelics, whether it's whatever it is, we all have a duty to continue working on these things, because the more of us that focus on it, well, more energy will go there. And the more energy we put into it, hopefully the more fruits we'll get to reap from that, and the more rewards we'll get to reap. And I think that's the future that I'm so excited about. And it's amazing that you guys are spearheading that, because, I think that we need as many people on this challenge as possible. And I think that at the same time, of course, like, it has been so challenging for me talking to people in different countries or even parts of America that cannabis is not legal in. And yet over an imaginary line, that plant is legal. And I'm trying to explain to them like how that makes sense, because it never does. But again, are we going to try to argue and stomp our feet in the ground about it, or are we going to do something to change it? And so having more options come out, I feel, is imperative, and James, I mean, this has been absolutely amazing, man. I am so excited I got to chat with you. It's so amazing to get to chat with someone who's on the cutting edge of this other side of all of this new amazing stuff happening. I want to make sure I give you an opportunity to tell people where they can find you, where they can find more about Mindset Pharma, keep up to date with you guys. Tell the people where they can find you, man.
Oh, sure. So, first of all, Ryan, thank you so much for having me on. It's been really a great, a real pleasure getting to chat with you.
Oh, thank you.
So Mindset Pharma, we're all over the internet. So, mindsetpharma.com is the website. Our email addresses are on, every press release that we put out. So if you just look those up, my email address is on there. Love chatting about psychedelic drugs. Doesn't have to be about Mindset Pharma. Please, if you're interested in learning more about any of this, don't hesitate to reach out for us, reach out to, the company or to me through the email. And thanks to everybody who took the time to listen to any portion of this. And Ryan, once again, thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome, James. And I got one last question for you, man. I ask everyone on the show this question, and I'd love to hear your answer. So let's say someone listens to this episode and they're excited to look into psychedelic drugs in their own life. What is the one piece of advice that you would suggest to them to allow them to use discernment in whether or not these medicines are right for them at this particular time in their lives?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I mean, I think they should. I think they should seek the wisdom of elders, and I think they should probably listen to some of this podcast.
Oh, dude, best answer I've ever gotten, James. You win. Hell yeah, man. Guys, I am consistently amazed by the incredibly stimulating and curiosity-provoking conversations I have the opportunity to co-create on this show. And this conversation with James was no exception. I feel it is imperative for us to continue to ask ourselves how we can allow these medicines to reach the most people possible. And the work James and his team at Mindset Pharma are doing is paramount in being able to achieve that goal. For anyone looking to contact James, learn more about Mindset Pharma, and stay up to date on all of the amazing things they are creating, scroll down to the show notes of this episode, where I will be laying out all of the easiest ways to do just that. James, thank you again for taking the time to share your journey and mission with the listeners and me today, for doing the incredible work you are doing to provide farther access to these medicines for the world at large, and for being a source of inspiration for countless individuals looking to dive into the world of psychedelic medicine safely and responsibly. And until next time, my brother, may your journey be smooth and full of light. Aho.